Hello guys, in our previous video we built a complete Spring Boot REST API with get, post, put and delete operation. But there is one major problem. As you can see in user service we are using the list. So whenever let's say if I want to add any records, it will not going to present when I restart the application. So I am on the Postman and let's see to get all the users API. So we are able to get 3 users and let me add one more user here like 6xyz and 25, so that user is created successfully now. And let me refetch again, and as you can see we got the 6. But once I restart the Spring Boot REST API and data will be get disappear. So let me restart it. Yeah, so once I again hit the get all users details, it will give me only 3 records. Why this is happening? Because that is obvious reason we are storing our user inside the Java list, which is this array list. So what happens when we restart our application? All data disappears. That's obviously not how we want the real application to work, right? So in this video we are going to replace our in-memory storage with PostgreSqL and Spring Data JPA. By the end of the video, you will have the REST API where all the users are actually stored in the database, and they will be still be there after restarting the application. So stay tuned till the end. So in the previous video, we have implemented this REST API like to get all the users, get user by ID, and post user like create the user, then put API for the user to update the information of the user, delete that user using by ID. So that's how we have done. And let me show you that what was in the previous video. So you have to refer that video first before moving here. So as you can see the previous architecture and new architecture with database. Yeah, like in previous video, we are using the in-memory list. So we have created an array list of the users in this service layer in the user service, and that we are consuming in the user controller in the API, and that API is getting called on the Postman. So that is how the request was flowing. But now what we are going to do, we are going to use the PostgreSQL and Spring Data JPA, where we are going to have the Postman as a client and user controller same, user service same. Then we will have the JPA repository, that user repository extend the JPA repository. And then we have the Hibernate, which will act as the object relational mapping. And it is internally connected with the Postgres database with Postgres SQL driver. So that's how we are going to see in this video. So as you know, we are going to use the PostgreSQL database in this project. So you have to install the PostgreSQL. Let me know if you need a tutorial for that to how we can install the PostgreSQL. Once the installation is done, you can see that services in your services. You can see that PostgreSQL is running by default. So I'm using that PostgreSQL Server 18. It is running there. And I'm using the DB to connect with my database so that I can run the query directly from here. So what you have to do, you have to go inside the like add a connection, and here you can see the database as PostgreSQL, and you can choose whatever like username and password you have kept for that your local machine PostgreSQL. So if you see that connection string of my this PostgreSQL database, you can see like this. This is localhost 5432 and PostgreSQL Postgres as database, then username and password, right? And let me go inside that like databases. You can see that we have databases as Postgres, and in that is we can have multiple schemas. So I have multiple schema here. We are going to use the public schema because as of now, if you see that I don't have any tables in that. So PostgreSQL is open source relational database widely used for the production application. In my current project also I'm using that PostgreSQL. Now let's add the dependency required to connect our Spring Boot application with PostgreSQL database. So there are two dependency which we need to add for database integration. Our Spring Web dependency is already present here, and because we are creating the REST API in the first episode. Now let's add the dependency which is required for us. So we are having the starter data JPA dependency and PostgreSQL dependency. So let's know like what is this Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency. So this dependency allow us to work with relational database using JPA and Spring Data JPA. So JPA stands for Java Persistent API, and it provides a standard way of mapping Java object to relational database tables. So let's say if we have the users entity, or like we can say the user model in the Java code, then that can be mapped with user table in the relational database. So you can think of JPA as the application, Hibernate as the implementation, and Spring Data JPA as the developer friendly layer that makes data access easier. And then the second dependency is the PostgreSQL. So this is the JDBC driver. This is the database specific driver that allow our Java application to communicate with PostgreSQL using JDBC, which stand for Java Database Connectivity. So the flow will look like something like this. Now, like we are going to have the REST controller service, which we have already as the user controller. That will going to request the service layer, which is the user service. Then service layer is going to call the communicate with JPA, and JPA will internally act use the Hibernate implementation to generate and execute the required SQL query. And PostgreSQL driver provides the connection to our Postgres database with the code which we have written. And we already have the Spring Boot web dependency in our previous from our previous video, which is responsible for the REST API and HTTP endpoints. So these components have different responsibility. Spring Web handles our REST API, Spring Data JPA handles our data access layer, and Hibernate provides the JPA implementation, and the PostgreSQL driver allow our application to communicate with PostgreSQL. So let's update the application.property file. And if you see, these are the property which we need to add. So you have to pick the data source URL, which will be like JDBC colon PostgreSQL localhost 5432 Postgres, and schema is equal to public. So if you see that my DB were, and inside that if I go edit connection, and here you can see that JDBC Postgres. So same URL we have, which is mentioned here, we have to use that URL in the application property file. And schema, based on your requirement, you can update a schema. So I'm going to use the public schema. So I have used, and if you see the last one, which is the Postgres, is nothing but the database name. It could be anything based on like whatever the application which we are implementing. And the username, I have used Postgres, password as QWERTY. For your system, you can have different password, and this is something related to Hibernate properties. So DDL hyphen auto update. This will be like whenever we are going to add anything related to JPA, it will going to do that changes in the database. If you don't want it, you can change the property like create drop and create only. So this kind of property you can add, but I'm going to use update here for test development purpose. But for production environment, you can change, right? Because in production we don't want to change the schema based on the whatever is developer has written. So that could be different. Then if you want to show the SQL in your like console, then you can put true here. And this is JPA properties, Hibernate format SQL, it is true. So I want the console should have the SQL in the formatted SQL kind of thing in the logs. So that's how we can put true. And we also need to add the Hibernate dialect. Here we can say like org.hibernate dialect Postgres SQL dialect. So this we also need to add. The dialect tells Hibernate which SQL syntax and database specific feature it should use when communicating with PostgreSQL, right? So with recent version of Hibernate, this property is generally optional. And if you're using the Spring Boot 3.x kind of version of the Spring Boot and Hibernate 6, so you need to add the dialect for PostgreSQL 10. Like here you have to put 10 or 95. So like this, you have to put, but if you are using the latest version, then you just have to use PostgreSQL dialect. Now let's create the user model here. So before doing that, we need to update this user, which we have already that UserDto. So let me make it as UserDto. So you have to right click like this and just click on the refactor, then rename. And I'm going to use as UserDto, because we are going to create a new model as username of users. So let me do the right click here and click on new and then class, then name as user, and we also need to update the package. So I'm going to use model here, right? So we have created this user model, and before like after that we have to add the entity because we are going to use the JPA here. So I'm going to use at that entity, and the table name where we can specify like this. So name equals to table. Like if you don't specify, it will going to create the name as same name as the class name. So better we can have the different like table name for this. Now we also need to add the ID. So I'm going to use the private long ID. This is the wrapper I'm going to use here, and we have to make it as a primary key. So put at that ID annotation here. So for primary key, we are going to use the generated value here, so that we no need to pass the value from our side. So we have to use the generated value, and the strategy like how the this value gets generated here. So click on strategy and generation type as identity. So in this indicates that a persistent provider must send the primary key for the entity using the database identity column, right? So identity, I'm going to use it here. Now let's create other fields. Let's say I am also want to have the name, then I also want to have the email, string email. Then let's have one more field as int age, because earlier in the episode 1 we have the age. Let's add one more field which is the password, because each user will have their own password. So and creates the getters and setters like this, then doing select all and generate it, right? So this is the entity part which we have done like this. Let me close this, and if you see now here in the public we don't have any entity, right? Any table here, right? And if I just do like select star from users, I will get like user does not exist, that relational does not exist. Now let me execute the sts code and let's see if we are able to get the table name as created. So run a Spring Boot app here. Yeah, so internally if you see that application has started and is detected that Hibernate dialect, and these are the property which is it is able to configure here, and it is also created the table like this, to create table and begin age integer and email varchar, name varchar, password varchar, and primary key which is the id. And once I go again in the PostgreSQL, I can see that information, right? So the table is created now. Now let's create the user repository. So let me close the application now, and let me close this outline as well, we don't need that. Now let me create the user repository. So what we can do here, we have to do the right click here and create one interface, because we are going to use the JPA repository interface directly. So rename this as repository, and the interface name as user repository. So this interface is going to extend the JPA repository, and here we are going to have the object as type as user, and the ID type which is the long. So if you see that in user entity we have kept the primary key as ID which is long type, so we also need to put the type will be user but ID will be long type. Yeah, so now let's update the user service class. So as you can see right now we are using the user list. For now we need to remove this, and instead of that we are going to use the database call. So if you see that user controller is not aware about what are things happening in the user service, and how it is fetching the information like user details in the backend. So like as you can see it is decoupled, like it is not linked with each other. It will just know like I have the reference, I have to call this function, but internal implementation is by default hidden in this case, right? So here you can see that we have the user detail which we'll get from the UI, but we need to pass the user kind of object, right? Which have the name, email, age, and password. And if I see the user DTO, that user DTO is having ID, name, and age, but it is not having email, right? And the password, but password we can say like we can generate internally, but we need to add the email here because email can be passed from the UI. And the id, like id I have to make it as long, so just putting the wrapper class here instead of primitive data type. And yeah, so that is done. And let me add getter setters for email. So generate the getter setter like this. Okay, now like we need to remove this list, and instead of that we need to pass, we need to call the user repository functions, right? But before that, like we need to have the mapper class. So let me create one mapper class here, like class, and you can say user mapper. And instead of model, let's create another package as mapper, because in future we can have more entity which we have to match. So I no need to, I don't want to create any object, like no one can create the object for this. So I will say like private user mapper, and here I will say like this, so that the object cannot be created from the outside. Let's create the function as public user DTO. It will return the user DTO, and the function name will be to DTO. It will accept the user as a parameter, and let's import these classes. So I'm using doing the control shift and add the suggestion. Now first check if user equals null, means whatever is coming in the function is by default null, right? So I will say return null from here. If it is not, then we have to convert this into the user DTO. So I will create another user DTO, user DTO, DTO equals to new user DTO, right? And let's DTO dat set age. I will say user dot get age, and DTO dot set email, user dot get email, DTO dot set id, user dot get id, right? Then DTO dot set name, user dot get name. On the UI we don't need to pass the password, so I'm not adding into that. And return DTO. So as you can see, like it is the very small example, but in like in production kind of environment we can have more different fields which we don't want to pass to the UI. So that's how we need this kind of functionality. This function will be static here. So let me put static because as we are not creating an object, so we are going to use this class name directly. So UserMapper dot to DTO to give me the DTO object. Let me add one more function which will have the public static user to entity. So let's say if we have the user DTO and we want to create in user object. So that could be requirement where in the post and put API we have the user DTO from the UI, and we want to create any user so that we can pass it to the repository function, right? So now let's start with the user service, as we have the mapper and user DTO and user. So let's create the reference for user repository. So I'm going to use user repository and user repository like reference, and we have to do the auto add here. So do that auto add so that it can create the object and do the dependency injection for user repository, right? So if you see that user repository extending user repository interface, and if you see inside that, it will going to have the functions which we need to get like details. So it will have the find all method, and it is also extending that list, CRUD repository, list paging and sorting, query by example. And once you go inside that as well, you can see that save all, find all, the function find all by ID. So these kind of functions we can see here. That again internally it is using that CRUD repository. So save function is here, exist by ID, find by ID, find all. So based on requirement, we can use any of the function and we can add in out logic, right? So let me go once again here and let's create the first function. So I will say like user repository dot, sorry, dot find all. Then we'll get all the users here, but what we need the user detail, list of user detail. If you see, the return type of this is the list of user, not user DTO. So let me convert this list into user into user DTO. So stream, then I will say here dot map, and as we have created a user mapper function, so user mapper, then colon to DTO, and then dot to list here. So if you see, we got as a return type user DTO. So this user mapper, we have used method resolution to call this function as DTO, which will give you the user DTO one by one, and we are converting into the list. So I will do here like return directly this. So you can do the formatting for this function. Okay. Now let's update the get user by ID function here. So let me remove the existing logic and update this long primitive type as a long wrapper type. And here I will do like this. So I will say user repository dot find by ID, and find by ID, and or else if it is not found, then we can return null, right? And we have to store it in one of the variables. So I will make it as user, and before returning we need to update like we need to return in the form of user DTO. So I will say user mapper dot to DTO and whatever the user which we found from the database, right? If you see that the to DTO function is having the null check, so if it is null, we are going to return the null values. So it will not going to impact the existing logic, and it will not going to fail this to DTO function. Now let's move to the create user function. Let me remove the existing logic, and so let's update the like name of this field, which is user DTO. And what I will do here now, before creating the object, I have to create that user DTO into my user object, right? So I will say user mapper dot to entity. So I will pass the user DTO in that, and then we need to also set the password, because we need the password. If you see in the table, we need the password as well. So I will say here in future we will do with some encryption, but for now we can say like update password with encryption, right? So that we can do in future, but for now I will just say like set password, and I will put it here 1tbc123, right? Now let me call this user repository again to save that data. So let's say we have done like this, and let's whatever is coming from the backend, let's store in the user. So it will have the ID now because that is coming from the database. And returning, we need to return the user mapper, right? User mapper dot to DTO, because we need to return the DTO. So it will not going to pass the password field, and that's how we can do, right? We no need to pass the password to the UI, right? So now let's come to the update user function. So let me remove the existing logic now, and let me replace the long primitive as long wrapper type, and user rename this variable as UserDto. So now we have, now first check if we are able to get anything from the backend, if that ID is still present in the database or not. So I will say UserDto. So let me copy from here directly, because we are just using that find by ID. So I will say like this, I will update the field name as user ID here, and if user equals null means that ID is not found. So what we are doing, let me check in the put API. So put API, we are doing the null check. If it is null, we are saying the user ID is not found. Okay. So let me go in the user service now, and I will say if user is null, return null, right? Otherwise, we need to update the record. Let's add the logic for updating user. So we got the user reference from database. This is my existing user information, and this is the information which is already coming from the UI. So, or we can say the API. So what I will do here, I will say user dot set name, which is coming from the user DTO dot get name, right? And we have to again say for set age, which is coming from the user DTO dot get age. Then user dot set email, which is coming from the user DTO dot get email, right? One more field is the password. So if the password, as you know, password is not coming, so I'm not going to change anything in the password. So I will use the same function as we are doing here, because in update and in this we have only the basic thing difference to pass the ID, and the main differentiator is the ID which is already present in the user model. So let's say like in the create user, at the first time we will not have any ID when we are creating two entity. In that, if you see, we don't have any ID here. And let's like in the update case, we are using like this function find by ID. So this user object will have the ID of that, and what internally it will do based on the ID which is present or not. If ID is not present, it will create it as a in it will create that record. If ID is present in the update case, ID will be present. In that case, it will going to update that record. So that's how the ID is the differentiator between create and update, or we can say the insert or update kind of functionality or query is happening behind the scene, right? So now let's create this function which is delete users. So for this, we need to just say like user repository dot delete, right? We just want to delete, so I will say delete by ID, and we need to pass this ID which is user ID, the long type, and we can also use here as long as wrapper instead of primitive type, right? So we have done with user service. Now let's move to the user controller, and let's see what is the error we are having here. So the error which we have as user I get by ID, so we need to pass this as long. So let me update it as long, and the put is also okay. Okay, so now let's start this application and test it. So run as a Spring Boot application, and internally you will, like in console, you can see all the query which is happening, or what are the things which is running, select query, insert query, whatever it is doing, we can see in the console. So let me do the first call, which is get all user. So just sending it, just calling that API. And if you see the first time, we will not get any record, but user refreshed successfully, but the data array will be blank, because as of now we don't have anything in my table. So let me add something in my table. So okay, now in Postman, let me create one of the users. So I will say age is there, ID, we no need to pass the ID now. So name as Ganesh, and age like this. Then email, we need to add email as well, which I will say ganesh@gmail.com. And so name, age, and email. So just call that API, and we got the response as user created successfully. Now hit this API get all user. We got this Ganesh user, right? And once I refresh this one, I will get the information like email, name, and password. The password is coming from where we have the service layer where we have added like hard coded the password as ABC123, right? Now let me create one more user. So instead of Ganesh, let's say Geeta is there, right? Age will be 24 and Geeta. Now that user is also created. Now let me do once again that get all users by. So we got able to get all this information. Now let me do this get user by ID for 2. So we got this 2. Now let me put some ID which is not present. So as you can see, we got 404 and user ID 3 not found, right? And not found here as well. Now let me add one more field, which is one more record in that Ramesh. Let's say age as 26 and Ramesh as the name. So we are able to insert that record. Now update one of the record. So let's say if I want to update the record number 2 with these details, name, age, and email. So yeah, so as you can see, we got this updated record. Now let me see if that user ID 2, which is Geeta, is updated with this record. So roll ID number 2, yeah, it is updated with this record name. So now let's try to delete the record number 3 from here. And if you see the user details deleted successfully, and if I do once again for record number 3, for that let me hit that API again, and we got 1 and 2. Let me delete 1 again like this, and record deleted successfully, and we got only 2. So that ID is 2. And let me call again, so we'll get 404 as that user is already deleted from the database, right? So if you see in the delete API, we are checking the user equals to null. If that whatever is coming from the get user by ID is returning us null, in that case we are throwing like we are sending that response entity as not found. But if in that case, we are just deleting that user information. So like this, we have completed all the API with testing with Postman. As we reach till the end of this video, we are going to have an assignment for you. So like you have to create one more field in the user entity, like phone number, and that phone number you have to pass from the UI. So you have to also create in the user DTO, and you have to do like create and update that phone number, so that you can get all this thing idea about, let's say if new requirement is coming and we need to add one more field, so that how you can do. So do that as a part of assignment. And if you see there is a problem in our API, like let's say if someone passed these information as blank or null, in that case also we are accepting that record. So let me remove that, and let me send it. So if you see that record is created, so we need to add the validations. So in the next video we will see like how we can add the validation, so that we can restrict the UI to send the invalid data to us, so that we can do using Spring Boot validation using added valid annotation. So if you want to learn how to build API that behaves like real production application, make sure you subscribe to Slash Code. Thank you.